Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's presentation. And today, AAA Tasmania is delighted to welcome Kim Heriot-Darragh. It's working now. Thank you. So I'll just introduce this evening's speaker. Kim is a research fellow with the Australia-India Institute. He's a strategic and defence analyst who spent 14 years with the Australian government. While posted to the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, he became the first Australian civilian to graduate from India's year-long National Defence College course. He previously served with the Australian government in Washington, D.C., and deployed as a civilian on military operations in Timor-Leste and Afghanistan. A former Indonesian linguist, he holds a Master of International Law and undergraduate degrees from the Australian National University. And in terms of the format for this evening's event, Kim is going to talk, and then we're going to cease the recording and conduct a Q&A session under Chatham House rules. So I'm going to hand over to Kim, who's going to talk to us about India and Pakistan in crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really glad that you joined, even though it's this nice little intimate group. I appreciate it. I care a lot about India, and I'm glad to share its significance with everyone. I think we were reminded about India's significance and Pakistan's recently, because obviously, you no doubt would have heard that this military clash occurred between the two of them. That was the thing that managed to make India and Pakistan cut through the news cycle in Australia. But otherwise, I'm not sure that it cuts through as much as it should. And India particularly has an importance that's growing. And so I think that we can't afford to be as complacent or to see these regions as distant from us and potentially not impacting us as much as they do. I also think we should never waste opportunities to learn from a crisis. India and Pakistan were in a crisis. There were two nuclear powers that were lobbing artillery and missile strikes at each other. And while I think that escalation into a nuclear conflict was quite unlikely, that's the kind of risk we can't rule out, and that kind of thing has catastrophic implications for us. So this talk is kind of my first crack at distilling some lessons for Australia from this conflict. So first, the background. I'm sure you would have been tracking this, but the recent clash, the most recent one, happened after terrorists stormed a tourist area in Kashmir. And they shot 26 civilians in this tourist hotspot. And there's a lot of details that we can discuss about that event, but there's two important bits of context that I'll mention. The first is that Pakistan obviously contests India's sovereignty in Kashmir, and it's benefited in the past from non-state groups conducting terrorist attacks there because that helps to portray Kashmir as disputed and to portray Kashmiris as resisting Indian sovereignty there. So when this attack happened, Indians immediately assumed that this likely was an attack that was supported by Pakistan. The second piece of context is that this was probably the most provocative terrorist attack that had occurred in India for quite some time, probably since the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Among other things, the gunmen approached civilians, isolated the men, and tried to identify what religion they were. And if they couldn't demonstrate that they were Muslim, they were shot. This was presumably designed to inflame communal tensions in India. And it was taken very personally and much more seriously, I think, in India than other attacks had. The most recent high-profile attack that had occurred before then was a few years prior, and it had attacked military targets. So while that also was provocative, this probably took things up a notch. India's response over roughly a week later was to strike terrorist sites in Kashmir and across the border in Pakistan. when it did that in this initial volley, it sought to avoid striking Pakistani military targets, which would have been an escalation. And it was trying to focus only on what it described as terrorist infrastructure. But while the targets were terrorists, the audience was Pakistan, and the message was, if you don't take care of this, we will. In that initial exchange, it seems likely that Pakistan may have shot down a few Indian aircraft. And that potentially was because India made this decision not to attack military targets in advance. For those nerdy enough to be interested, when you do a strike using your Air Force, you would typically attack enemies' radar and air defense systems so that they are blind and can't shoot you down. To do that, that would have been provocative, essentially an act of war. So India appears to have made the calculation not to do that and to leave its aircraft vulnerable. It did that, and it appears to have lost potentially a small number of aircraft. That could have been an off-road for conflict because India would have struck terrorist sites and Pakistan could have said that it defended, the transgression of its sovereignty by shooting down these aircraft, and that could have been the end of it, but it wasn't. In the following days, what ensued was strikes using artillery, small arms fire, missiles, air launch strikes, and increasingly, as we'll see in the future, drones. And this continued basically until the 10th. And there was a ceasefire, and that was quite a controversial ceasefire, and we can get into why. The first thing that I think Australia needs to note from this is that this isn't the last exchange that's going to occur along these lines. And the reason is it's nearly impossible to stop any terrorist attack all the time, and Pakistan has very little incentive to help India on that front. In some ways, Pakistan benefited from this entire exchange because though you can debate the outcomes of the military conflict itself, what it managed to do was put the dispute over Kashmir back onto the international radar. And in doing so, a lot of the global audience saw this as essentially a fairly legitimate territorial dispute whose nuances they didn't understand, and that therefore the rights and wrongs of it were not necessarily accessible. And essentially what this allowed Pakistan to do was now reassert itself as an equal partner competing with India with legitimate claims over Kashmir. Beyond that, Pakistan has a really entrenched strategic culture of exploiting terrorist groups like this. That's something I experienced in Afghanistan with cross-border terrorism. Insurgents would conduct attacks in Afghanistan and flee the border. That culture has been entrenched since Pakistan's independence, and it shows little signs of changing. So in the meantime, on the Indian side, India's fatigue over these attacks and the anger at cross-border terrorism keeps growing. And it's growing at the same time that confidence in India as a serious global power is growing, and confidence in its military strength is also growing. In the wash-up of the conflict between the two countries, India's military was widely perceived within India to have performed really well and to have retained dominance at each stage of escalation in the conflict without approaching nuclear thresholds. So there are debates in India among the strategic community about the merits of its response, but those debates tend to focus on niche nuances. The general consensus is India confronted an intractable problem in Pakistan. It has now found a way to operate militarily to inflict costs on Pakistan for that behavior without risking nuclear war. And to complicate things further, another part is the use of drones that we saw in this. Now, that's probably not the first time, obviously, we've seen drones be used in the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. But this was the first time I'm aware of that I saw drones be used so heavily in this context. And a lot of strategic analysts saw that as a positive thing because it allowed both sides to be really calculated in terms of what they struck. You could position a drone quite carefully across exactly your target And so therefore there would be comparatively less risk of you sending a signal that you didn't intend to send, or concerning your adversary that you were striking something more sensitive than you actually were. I think there's a flip side to that though, and that is those drones enabled both sides to do things that they may not have done had their only option been to use a highly sophisticated aircraft with a pilot who risked being shot down, losing very expensive and valuable equipment, and giving the other side a solid propaganda win. So in some ways, drones became a low-cost means for both sides to inflict damage and for them to go deeper into each other's territory than they have in quite some decades to conduct strikes. That's going to be a feature in the next conflict too. And I think it could increase the temptation for either side to use violence when otherwise the threshold for doing so might have been higher. And then at the political level, Indian Prime Minister Modi has cultivated an image of strength among his supporters. His responses to these kinds of threats has been growing steadily more muscular over the years, and his public supports him for it. When both sides reached their ceasefire, India declared that any act of terrorism would now be considered an act of war. That's a pretty difficult statement to walk back from, considering that terrorist attack is a near certainty. And then just to sort of add more bloom to the picture, I'm speculating about this, but I suspect that India could be less likely to listen to calls for restraint from the US next time around. In the past, the US's intervention has been helpful to sort of encourage both sides to reach some kind of a ceasefire and create space to take the heat out of the dispute. But Trump took credit for this. He implied, among a few things, that India and Pakistan had agreed to negotiate sovereignty over Kashmir following the ceasefire. That's not a position that India would have agreed to or would support, and it would have overturned decades of Indian policy. So the popular interpretation of that in India, among the general population, but also among fairly influential strategists, was that India had the strong position in the conflict. It was dominating for the most part. It had Pakistan where it wanted. It agreed to a ceasefire, and then in doing so, not only did it cede its strong military position, but it also lost political ground. I'm not sure how amenable India will be to that kind of interaction again. So I don't think Australians, to put it lightly, should be at all surprised for another incident like this to happen in the next 5 or 10 years and for it to potentially be more dangerous. So I think potential for war between nuclear powers is a pretty good reminder that South Asia matters a lot to Australia, even though it's a little bit further removed from our imagination than Southeast Asia is. It's not the only reason, but it's a good starting point. India's strategic importance to Australia has been growing over the last decade or two. A lot of that is down to shared concerns about China. It's also about both sides having quite complementary objectives in Southeast Asia and the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Essentially, Australia is more likely to achieve its objectives in those regions if India is working in a complementary way than it is without that kind of cooperation. And beyond that, we have a pretty big Indian and Pakistani diaspora in Australia. Off the top of my head, I think we have roughly 1 million Indian origin citizens in Australia. That's about 4% of the population. Pakistan is not as, Pakistan origin diaspora members are not as numerous, but I think they're about 100,000. And it's funny when I think about that, for that really large and visible presence of South Asian diaspora members in Australia, I don't know that that's translated into a broad cultural and political familiarity with the region as much as it probably should have yet in the community. I think, maybe you can correct me, but I think a lot of Australians think about India in terms of cricket and curry. maybe the local restaurant, but I don't know that there's that much cultural familiarity, and I don't know that there's that much meaningful interchange or literacy. I think and I hope that will change organically in the community over time. But one thing I think Australia needs to get a grip on at an official level is that lack of literacy among in the bureaucracy. Government officials can't afford that luxury of time, and I think that we need to make deliberate efforts to heighten South Asia literacy. Now, there are pockets of it, and I can go down a rabbit warren, but perhaps I can leave that for Q&A. And I'm leaving Pakistan aside for a second purely for self-interested reasons, which is Pakistan isn't as significant to Australia strategically as India is. But as a general comment, I'd say the Indian system isn't for beginners. It's a lot bigger and a lot more complex than any other I've engaged with. And those navigating it could really benefit from prior education, training, and experience much more than they can get away with in a lot of other cultural and political contexts. The next lesson I think we might learn is that Australia has pretty limited influence in the region. And we might need to be a bit more judicious about where we place our resources in the future. So right now, India is probably pressuring Australia to diminish its defence relationship with Pakistan. And I think in Australia, that can be met with some bemusement on some level, because to us, that cooperation with Pakistan is quite modest. It's quite niche. And we have a tendency in the Australian system to make a point of retaining military links with a lot of countries, including those we don't agree with, as a link of last resort. So the political relationship can falter, but at the end of the day, you will hopefully have members of each military who can pick up the phone to each other, diffuse something, translate something between each other. And a lot of the ways that we do that is through relatively benign military cooperation. So we'll arrange for a Pakistani student to study a master's degree at one of our military colleges, and we'll have an Australian officer do the same in Pakistan. So to us, that kind of cooperation is really quite benign. But to India, it's probably less about a suspicion that we are somehow building Pakistan's military capabilities. And it's probably more a sense that we're legitimizing a state sponsor of terror in their mind. Now, I have a few thoughts about that. One of them is we shouldn't make decisions about our relationship with a country like Pakistan or any country just to placate India. But I do think it's worth asking how much influence we think we're likely to build in Pakistan. I mentioned that the strategic culture within its military and how entrenched it is. It's a military of a bit over 500,000 strong, if I remember right. Offering a handful of master's degree programs per year isn't really going to tip the balance in terms of Pakistan's priorities or outlook or behaviour. But a handful of those master's programs could really go a long way in a country like the Maldives, which is really receptive, is small, and offers an opportunity for us to have outsized impact for a relatively small investment. And in terms of the country like the Maldives, its strategic importance to Australia is growing. So I think Australia could probably stand to consider how it calibrates some of its South Asian relationships in the wake of this spat. India's long-term challenge is China, and that's obviously a really big part of the reason that Australia is so invested in engaging it. That often manifests in the shape of maritime cooperation or maritime security cooperation. And Australia has an incentive to encourage that kind of engagement in a sense, to encourage, for example, the Indian Navy to get more involved in security operations further east, and to engage more in partners that we really care about, including Southeast Asian partners. But Delhi doesn't always have the luxury of focusing on those issues exclusively. And of course, this clash is a perfect illustration of why. It's got real challenges on its doorstep. China actually knows this and will tend to exploit that reality to keep India on its toes too. I think that's relevant to us because I have a criticism of Canberra and the way it sees India. It's not all of Canberra, but you will often find two strands of thought about India, or two images of what India is. The first image is India, the great power that we hope will provide a meaningful check on China's excesses. And the other is the dismissive crew that says India shouldn't do that, or won't do that. We shouldn't be naive about that. And we should not really be investing so heavily in this relationship. And I don't think that either of those images is true. I don't think it's true of Australia either. I think both countries will sometimes face limitations that mean that their commitment in one area will have to be temporarily withdrawn while they focus on another. And I think that's just kind of the reality of global politics. Just one example for us is the fact that our Navy fleet is going to temporarily shrink as some platforms are taken out of service and others are introduced on the path to gradually increasing the fleet's overall size in the long term. So that'll be an example. When our fleet is smaller, we'll be able to contribute less to maritime security operations, and we might well be asking India to step up with and for us as well. So I think that the point to me is to focus less on seeing India as one single thing or assuming that India will behave in line with priorities that we anticipate or hope for, and instead focus on setting the foundations so that we have really deep and close relationships, and that there's institutional familiarity, and so therefore there's flexibility to respond. So if both sides do need to collaborate on something that wasn't necessarily foreseen, they've done their homework and they can do it quicker. I think the next lesson for us is that the US, I think, may have ceded a lot more influence than Trump probably realizes after this conflagration. I mentioned before the frustration with Trump's comments about the ceasefire. Some of the context for that was that Modi was forced to come out and publicly refute those comments, and he wouldn't have appreciated being seen to cede India's advantage in the clash and to essentially get publicly embarrassed. Now, India is a really pragmatic state, and I don't know that it's going to radically change its relationship with the US because of that. Power and influence and needs often speak for themselves. But just in case you didn't think it could be worse, in some really terrible timing, a very senior American general who oversees Central Command, whose coverage includes Pakistan, had to testify for Congress. And in the wake of this conflict and really sensitive interaction between Pakistanis and Indians, this general labelled Pakistan as an outstanding partner in counterterrorism for America. That was really inflammatory, and that really offended a lot of Indians who felt like they lost people and felt that America had forgotten that Osama bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan too. So like I said, India is very pragmatic. It's not as though it's going to suddenly cancel the relationship with the US. But there has been, and there is, a strand of foreign policy thought in India that remains quite attached to the non-alignment kind of philosophy. And that constituency will kind of ebb and flow in terms of its influence in the Indian government. I think that group of people may have an amplified voice now for a little while. And Australia is going to need to be mindful of that. And I think where you could potentially see that play out is in Quad cooperation. You might have heard a lot being made out of cooperation between four partners: India, Japan, the US, and Australia, focused on security. Often the practicalities of cooperation between those four leverages a lot of US architecture and technology and platforms. I wonder if there's going to be increased reluctance to leverage that kind of a backbone and essentially lock India in further into cooperating with America in that context. And you might see greater appetite for alternatives to be found, which allow cooperation with the US in certain contexts, but pay great care to not locking India into those kinds of systems. I think it offers us an opportunity though, because we're already carving out our bilateral cooperation with India. And in some ways, our approach is complementary to this, because the thought is it makes sense that we have a patchwork of cooperation between all sorts of regional countries, and they're not mutually exclusive. So even if the US turns slightly colder on pursuing cooperation with the US, the broader regional objectives are still served by bilateral and unilateral cooperation. So the appeal of non-alignment extends to military procurement too. Western countries tend to view militaries that source equipment from multiple countries with caution, because we often will tend to see that approach to procurement as potentially inefficient, potentially costly, because it complicates maintenance and logistics. But also often military systems are designed to work with each other and to be compatible within a broader family. So you'll often find that military equipment tends to be more networked and connected with platforms that are sourced from a similar region or the same country or the same industries. India has taken a different approach, and it's really prioritized procuring equipment from diverse sources and avoiding reliance on any single partner. And it's also been on a push to build military equipment indigenously. If there was doubt about that approach, it's sort of been quashed for now, because India's systems actually performed really well and better than probably some observers expected. Its hodgepodge of air defense systems were procured from all over the globe and included some indigenous components. And they largely defended all meaningful attacks from Pakistan into its airspace. It largely defended most of its facilities. So I think that's going to give a lot of Indians, including Indians within the official system, much more confidence in their approach and a confidence in the idea that they were better off going it alone, or to foster self-reliance rather than get too linked in with any single partner. And I think part of that discussion was also informed by, again, Trump's comments when he was trying to encourage Ukraine to negotiate in the context of Russia, and he made a big show of being able to switch off aspects of US support to Ukrainian US sourced equipment. Indians were watching that very carefully, and they will see the US as a particularly unreliable partner. And so that again reinforces this idea that it shouldn't get too far embedded with the US. The army in India is traditionally the dominant service. Part of that is that that's a cultural thing, and that's a historical remnant. Australia probably in some ways is similar. It's also the most numerous. The army, I think, is 1 million strong. And the Navy is comparatively really quite small, so is the Air Force. Traditionally, the army was also known as the one that takes the lead on the borders with Pakistan and with China. Only just recently, the effective head of the Indian military a couple of years ago made a comment that the Air Force was the supporting arm for the army. This time, arguably, the reverse was true. I think that air power really carried the day, and it showed that both sides were paying close attention to lessons from Ukraine and Russia, and were incorporating lessons to figure out how they would, when the next conflict happens, inflict costs in the way that they needed to on their adversary. That's relevant for Australia because we're deepening defence relationships across a lot of domains with India. But in the rush to build our connections with India, we've really focused on the obvious common elements. And because maritime security matters, we've really gone hard on Navy cooperation. And we also have an army exercise, which is not as well developed, but it is routine and it is regular. But we don't have an Air Force exercise, and the relationship is still at quite a nascent stage. At AII, we recently wrote a report where we're advocating for some of that balance to be addressed. I think part of the reason that we haven't done more is because Australia only has a fairly modest fleet size and it's pretty busy. So taking highly sophisticated aircraft offline to do an exercise carries an opportunity cost. India's Air Force is also busy, including defending its borders. But there's lots of cooperation we can do that doesn't involve those kinds of platforms. And we saw in this conflict and in other contexts that defending airfields is really important. That doesn't require jets. That involves often troops, Air Force troops on the ground. And that's relevant not just to India and the border with Pakistan. That's relevant to India, which has really sensitive airfields in the oceans not far from us on Andaman Nicobar Island. So does Australia on Cocos Keeling Island. And Australia right now is in the process of figuring out how can it be more resilient to potential war, which means dispersing airfields and making them more resilient to attack. So I think there's a lot of room for cooperation, and this should serve as a reminder for us. And then the last point was it was incredibly difficult for outsiders to have any real sense of what was happening in the conflict as it was unfolding because of the sheer volume of fake news that was coming out of both countries. Pakistan's attempts to influence global opinion were broadly seen as more effective than India's. I tend to think that's true, and I think there are a few factors. One of them is that it's more practiced at it. It's the weaker of the two countries, and it relies on credible and persuasive communication to get global audiences on side. It helps that it's very dominated by the military, so it can control messaging more effectively than a messier democracy like India can. For another, I think India made a big mistake, which was to direct most of its messaging internally. So it was convincing its audience that it was responding resolutely, ethically, and with good sense of calibration. But globally, there wasn't a big push to send its ambassadors out to media outlets to say, this is our case for why we have behaved this way. Here's our evidence for suggesting that Pakistan was behind or at least complicit in this attack. And by the time that deficiency was recognized, the response was to send politicians to a handful of countries to make the case. But in my opinion, that was too little too late. I also think that some Indian frustration about the way the contest was portrayed in the media was a bit misplaced because they focused really heavily on the frustration that Pakistani claims to have shot down lots of Indian aircraft were getting free airplay across the world, but Indian counterclaims weren't. That may have been the case, but I think it was the wrong thing to focus on. I think the bigger battle to fight was the battle over who is the more sympathetic in this case. And I think the focus on being seen to have been the victor over Pakistan translated into a combative approach on news channels and sort of sidesteps the broader argument about who was the victim in this and who was the aggressor. Some of the Indian TV clips that got circulated in Australia were really aggressive, almost comical. And I ended up speaking to Australians who had no context for the dispute, but saw a single clip from Indian TV and based on that assumed that India was the aggressor. So I think that's a lesson for us, particularly as we're grappling with our own security challenges, and we're starting to consider how we can engage the Australian community a lot more meaningfully on defence policy as tensions potentially worsen with China. I think that's a good place to leave things. Thank you.